At 4:13 in the morning on April 1st, 17 Iranian Shahed 136 loitering munitions crossed into Saudi airspace from Iraqi territory and proceeded uncontested across 780 kilometers of desert before striking the Ras Tanura oil terminal complex on the Persian Gulf coast. The attack lasted 14 minutes from first impact to final detonation. When it was over, the world's largest crude oil export facility had sustained damage to 4 of its 6 primary loading berths, 2 offshore mooring platforms, and the main pumping station that channels 5 million barrels per day from the Gawa field to waiting tankers. Saudi Arabia's ability to deliver crude oil to global markets had been reduced by approximately 40% in less than a quarter of an hour. The strike was not the result of intelligence failure or defensive system malfunction. It was the result of a strategic calculation that American extended deterrence guarantees protecting critical Saudi infrastructure no longer carried the weight they held for the previous 4 decades. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications before going any further. What happened at Ras Tanura this morning is not simply a military event confined to regional theatre dynamics. It is an economic and strategic rupture whose consequences will cascade through global energy markets, insurance actuarial models, and the fundamental architecture of Persian Gulf security guarantees for months, regardless of what diplomatic frameworks emerge in response. The pace at which operational realities are diverging from official characterizations of Iranian strike capacity and American deterrence credibility means viewers cannot afford to be behind this analysis when the next phase of escalation materializes. This analysis documents the gap between what official briefings acknowledge and what the evidence demonstrates. To understand the full weight of what happened, it is necessary to first understand what Ras Tanura actually represents to global energy infrastructure, because this was not a strike against one of several Saudi export facilities. It was a strike against the single most critical petroleum logistics choke point in the entire global supply chain. Ras Tanura handles between 5 and 7 million barrels of crude oil exports daily. That volume represents approximately 5% of total global oil consumption and nearly 15% of all internationally traded crude. The facility processes the overwhelming majority of output from the Gawa field, the largest conventional oil field on Earth, whose production alone exceeds the entire national output of every OPEC member except Iraq and the UAE combined. The terminal operates 6 offshore loading berths capable of simultaneously filling very large crude carriers, the 300,000 deadweight ton tankers that transport Saudi crude to refineries in Asia, Europe and North America. Ras Tanura has no equivalent alternative within Saudi Arabia's export infrastructure. The Yanbu terminal on the Red Sea coast handles less than 40% of Ras Tanura's daily throughput and lacks the offshore mooring infrastructure to accommodate VLCC-class vessels. For Saudi Arabia to maintain current export commitments to Asian markets, which account for 68% of its crude sales, Ras Tanura is the only option that exists. That geographic and infrastructural reality is the strategic context without which the attack cannot be properly understood. Iran did not destroy one of several options. It destroyed the only option capable of maintaining Saudi Arabia's contractual obligations to refineries in China, Japan, South Korea and India, whose combined crude imports from the kingdom exceed 8 million barrels daily. The economic consequences of this disruption extend far beyond Saudi revenue calculations. They reach directly into the diesel fuel costs of European trucking companies, the jet fuel expenses of American airlines, and the petrochemical input prices for plastics manufacturers, whose production costs determine consumer prices for products ranging from packaging materials to automotive components. The repair timeline tells the full story of the economic disruption ahead. Offshore mooring platform damage of the type sustained at Ras Tanura requires replacement of structural elements that cannot be fabricated on site. The specialized components must be manufactured at shipyards in South Korea or Singapore, transported by heavy lift vessels, and installed during weather windows that permit the precise marine construction operations necessary for offshore petroleum infrastructure. Platform repairs alone will take between 8 and 14 weeks under optimal conditions. The pumping station sustained damage to turbine housings and control systems that maintain the pressure differential necessary to move crude from inland storage tanks through subsea pipelines to loading berths 6 kilometres offshore. The entire pumping system will likely need to be disassembled, inspected for structural integrity, and recalibrated, a 6 to 9 week project requiring specialised personnel from Aramco's engineering divisions and international contractors with security clearances for critical infrastructure access. Now to the question that defence analysts across Washington, Riyadh and Jerusalem are already examining with urgency. Why did Saudi Arabia's integrated air defence network fail to intercept 17 subsonic drones travelling at 185 kilometres per hour across open desert for more than 4 hours? The kingdom's air defence architecture includes American-supplied Patriot PAC-3 batteries, which were specifically positioned to defend critical energy infrastructure following the 2019 Abqaiq attacks. Those systems were fully operational on the morning of April 1st. They detected the incoming Shahed 136 platforms. Radar operators tracked the drones for the entire duration of their flight path from the Iraqi border to the Persian Gulf coast. Patriot batteries fired a total of 23 interceptor missiles at the incoming swarm. Not one interception succeeded. The failure was not random and it was not a malfunction. It was the result of a weapon system specifically engineered to defeat exactly this kind of defensive response. According to assessments from multiple defense intelligence sources with access to telemetry data from the engagement, the 17 Shahed 136 units approached Ras Tanura in a dispersed formation pattern that exploited the engagement mathematics of missile defense systems designed to intercept ballistic projectiles rather than low-altitude cruise profiles. Each drone maintained an altitude between 80 and 120 metres above ground level, below the optimal engagement envelope for Patriot interceptors, which achieve highest probability of kill against targets at altitudes above 1,000 metres, where radar tracking is unobstructed and interception geometry favours the defender. The Shahed 136 flight profile forces Patriot systems into terminal phase intercepts, where closing velocities are dramatically reduced, and the interceptor must execute steep descent angles that reduce kinetic energy at impact below the threshold necessary to guarantee target destruction. The swarm employed what defense analysts identify as saturation approach geometry, not simultaneous arrival from a single vector but staggered timing across multiple approach corridors that forced Saudi air defense operators into serial engagement decisions rather than coordinated defensive volleys. Patriot batteries defending Ras Tanura faced a tactical dilemma built into the intercept mathematics. Each interceptor missile costs approximately $4 million. Each Shahed 136 drone costs between $20,000 and $50,000, depending on production variant. Engaging 17 targets required committing between $68 and $85 million in interceptor inventory to destroy platforms whose combined manufacturing cost totaled less than $1 million. That cost asymmetry becomes unsustainable when multiplied across the dozens of critical infrastructure sites that Saudi Arabia must defend simultaneously against potential Iranian strike campaigns. The economic mathematics of the engagement reveal the strategic logic Iran is executing. Saudi Arabia cannot afford to expend interceptor inventory at rates of 23 missiles per engagement when Iranian drone production capacity exceeds 200 units monthly, according to assessments from US Central Command intelligence directorates. The kingdom's Patriot interceptor stockpile, even with accelerated procurement from American defense contractors, cannot match the replacement rate necessary to sustain defensive operations against sustained Iranian drone campaigns targeting energy infrastructure. Iran has engineered an asymmetric cost structure that makes comprehensive air defense economically prohibitive, regardless of technical interception capability. If this channel is providing the analysis this situation deserves, the kind that explains mechanisms rather than simply reporting events, subscribe now and share this video with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening behind the daily headline cycle. When the insurance market responses to this strike begin cascading through global shipping costs, when the contractual penalty clauses in Saudi crude supply agreements begin generating legal disputes with Asian refineries, when the replacement costs for damaged infrastructure begin appearing in Aramco financial disclosures, the analysis will be here. The economic consequences of what is happening militarily have now reached a scale that extends far beyond the Persian Gulf theatre and into the daily economic reality of households across North America, Europe and Asia, with no direct involvement in regional conflicts. And understanding the specific mechanisms by which this infrastructure strike is generating those consequences is essential to understanding why they will not resolve quickly, even if diplomatic frameworks manage to prevent further escalation. Global crude oil prices increased by $12 per barrel in the 18 hours following confirmation of the Ras Tanura strike, moving from $87 to $99 on Brent futures contracts. That price movement translates directly into gasoline costs at pumps across the United States, where the average retail price for regular unleaded increased by 34 cents per gallon in the week following the attack, according to data from the American Automobile Association. For a household driving two vehicles averaging 12,000 miles annually at 25 miles per gallon combined fuel economy, the price increase represents an additional $326 in annual fuel costs. That figure multiplied across 250 million registered vehicles in the United States alone represents a $81.5 billion annual wealth transfer from American consumers to global energy producers. The diesel fuel price impact carries even broader economic consequences because diesel powers the commercial trucking fleet that moves consumer goods from ports and distribution centers to retail locations. Diesel prices increased by 41 cents per gallon in the same post-strike period. The American Trucking Association calculates that every 1 cent increase in diesel prices adds $400 million annually to industry operating costs, costs that are passed through to consumer prices for groceries, building materials, and manufactured goods transported by truck. The 41-cent increase therefore represents $16.4 billion in additional logistics costs that will appear as incremental price increases across thousands of consumer product categories over the coming months. Jet fuel prices, which move in correlation with crude and diesel markets, increased by 38 cents per gallon. The International Air Transport Association estimates that fuel represents 28% of airline operating costs. The price increase translates to approximately $14 billion in additional annual costs for global commercial aviation, expenses that airlines will recover through ticket price increases, and fuel surcharges that make air travel more expensive for business travelers and vacationing families alike. The insurance market response to the Ras Tanura strike has generated cascading cost increases that extend beyond energy sector coverage into broader commercial insurance pricing. War risk insurance premiums for tankers calling at Persian Gulf terminals increased from 75% of hull value to 4% of hull value in the 5 days following the attack, according to assessments from Lloyd's of London underwriters. For a very large crude carrier valued at $120 million, that increase represents an additional $390,000 per voyage in insurance costs alone. Those costs are incorporated into shipping rates charged to refineries, which pass the expenses through to wholesale fuel distributors, which ultimately embed the costs in retail prices paid by consumers filling vehicles at gas stations. The petroleum industry property insurance market has begun repricing coverage for critical infrastructure in the Persian Gulf region, following the demonstration that existing air defense systems cannot reliably prevent Iranian drone strikes against hardened targets. Actuarial models that previously calculated single-digit probability percentages for successful strikes against facilities like Ras Tanura are being revised upward to reflect operational realities that defensive systems cannot guarantee protection. Saudi Aramco's annual property insurance costs, which totaled approximately $400 million prior to the strike, are projected to increase by between 60 and 85% when policies come up for renewal in the third quarter, according to estimates from insurance industry analysts. That increase represents $240 to $340 million in additional annual costs that will be recovered through crude oil pricing to refineries worldwide. The contractual penalty structure built into Saudi crude supply agreements with Asian refineries has begun generating legal disputes that threaten long-term supply relationships worth hundreds of billions of dollars over multi-year contract periods. Chinese refineries operating under take-or-pay contracts with Aramco are invoking force majeure clauses and demanding penalty payments for delivery shortfalls that have already reached 800,000 barrels per day in the 2 weeks since the Ras Tanura strike. Saudi Arabia's position is that the attack constitutes an act of war that triggers force majeure protections, exempting the kingdom from contractual penalties. Chinese legal teams are arguing that Saudi Arabia's failure to maintain adequate defensive systems protecting critical infrastructure constitutes negligence that voids force majeure protections. The legal dispute involves potential penalty payments totaling between $2 and $7 billion over the remaining term of existing contracts, creating uncertainty in crude supply relationships that underpin Asian economic growth. The broader strategic question that emerges from assembling all of these elements is the one that defense policy analysts across the ideological spectrum are beginning to ask with increasing urgency. Can the United States maintain extended deterrence guarantees protecting allied critical infrastructure in the Persian Gulf when the cost-exchange ratios favour adversaries employing weapons systems that American defensive technology cannot economically counter at scale? For 4 decades, American security guarantees to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Cooperation Council states operated on the assumption that U.S. military technological superiority created asymmetric advantages that made attacks on critical infrastructure prohibitively costly for potential adversaries. That assumption has been systematically dismantled by Iranian development of weapons systems specifically designed to exploit the economic vulnerabilities in American defensive architectures. The Shahed 136 platform represents the operational expression of that strategy. It is too slow to justify expensive interceptor expenditure, too numerous to defeat through attrition, and too cheap to impose meaningful costs on Iranian strike capacity through counterattacks on production facilities. The Ras Tanura strike occurred 3 weeks after the U.S. Central Command commander testified before Congress that Iranian offensive capacity against Gulf energy infrastructure had been degraded by enhanced intelligence sharing with Saudi Arabia and accelerated deliveries of American air defense systems. The gap between that assessment and the operational reality documented by 17 drones striking the world's largest oil terminal with 0 interceptions is not simply a communications problem. It is a strategic vulnerability that Iran has now demonstrated it can exploit repeatedly without risking assets that would justify American military retaliation. Both the United States and Saudi Arabia are projecting confidence that the damage will be rapidly repaired and that defensive improvements will prevent similar strikes in the future. The evidence suggests something considerably more complicated. The most successful Iranian infrastructure strike of the entire regional conflict sequence arrived just weeks after American defense officials were publicly stating that enhanced defensive cooperation had significantly reduced Iranian strike effectiveness. That contradiction may be the most revealing data point of the entire strategic picture. The repair timeline extending into late June or early July means that global crude markets will operate with 8 million barrels per day of missing Saudi export capacity through the peak summer driving season in North America and Europe, the period of highest annual gasoline demand. That supply deficit cannot be offset by American strategic petroleum reserve releases, which are already drawn down by 180 million barrels from releases during the previous 18 months. OPEC spare production capacity currently totals approximately 8 million barrels per day, insufficient to replace the Saudi shortfall. The mathematical reality is that global oil markets will remain undersupplied by between 700,000 and 1 million barrels daily for at least the next 90 days, a structural deficit that will sustain elevated crude prices regardless of diplomatic progress on containing the regional conflict. The insurance cost increases will remain in effect even after Ras Tanura returns to operational status because actuarial models do not reset to previous assumptions after successful attacks demonstrate that prior probability calculations were incorrect. The higher premiums represent permanent cost increases that will persist until and unless defensive systems demonstrate sustained capability to prevent similar strikes over multi-year periods. That sustained demonstration has not occurred and cannot occur until technologies capable of economically countering low-cost drone swarms are deployed at scale across dozens of critical infrastructure sites simultaneously. The strategic implications extend beyond Persian Gulf energy security into fundamental questions about American alliance commitments worldwide. If the United States cannot credibly guarantee protection of critical infrastructure for allies hosting forward-deployed American forces and depending on American security umbrellas, the value proposition of those alliances begins eroding for partners who must weigh the costs of alignment against the benefits of hedging strategies that include accommodation with regional adversaries. Saudi Arabia's willingness to maintain current levels of defense cooperation with Washington depends substantially on confidence that American technology and intelligence sharing actually provides meaningful protection against Iranian strike capabilities. The Ras Tanura attack has introduced significant doubt into that calculation. Here is where the complete strategic picture stands on day 14 following the strike. Saudi crude exports remain 40% below pre-attack levels. Global oil prices remain elevated by $11 to $13 per barrel above early March baselines. Insurance costs for Persian Gulf energy infrastructure have increased by 60 to 85% across property and war risk categories. Asian refineries are pursuing legal remedies for delivery shortfalls totaling 800,000 barrels daily. American consumers are paying 34 cents more per gallon for gasoline and 41 cents more per gallon for diesel fuel. Iranian drone production continues at rates exceeding 200 units monthly. Saudi Arabia's Patriot interceptor inventory has been depleted by 23 missiles with 0 successful engagements. Iran achieved all of this without losing a single aircraft, without conducting manned missions, and without deploying weapons systems that would justify American direct military retaliation under existing rules of engagement. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. When the next infrastructure strike demonstrates that the Ras Tanura engagement was not an isolated success, but a repeatable operational model, when insurance markets begin pricing Persian Gulf energy assets as uninsurable at economically viable premiums, when Saudi Arabia begins exploring defensive cooperation frameworks with actors outside the American alliance structure, the analysis will be here. Evidence first. What it means for households and strategic stability always. Leave one question in the comments before you go. Can current American air defense technology keep pace with the distributed low-cost strike platforms being demonstrated in this conflict, or are we watching extended deterrence guarantees being tested beyond their operational design limits? Every response gets read and considered. This is the analysis that documents what official briefings have not addressed.